Imagine being labeled as bad from the very start, before you ever had a chance to prove yourself, being absolutely confident in the team you just drafted, only to have half the division laugh in your face. Intermediate A didn't have an easy season, but they sure as anything else had an exciting one. Being the underdogs has its advantages, one of which being that no one sees it coming when you strike back. Not only did Inter A prove that they could keep up with the best of them, but they even managed to produce a team that made it all the way to the grand finals. While they did fall short, their statement was heard loud and clear. We don't care about your predictions, just try to stop us.
Of all the teams in the intermediate splits, Inter A arguably had the most interesting picks for managers. There was only one returning manager, with Shash once again picking up where he left off in Season 1 with Papega Parrots, but then the rest are complete newcomers to their positions. While Croc and Kits were complete newcomers to the community as a whole, at the very least, Octo, Sirmi, and the Platinum Bow had been around and knew how things worked for the most part. That being said, Vitalize had an interesting case with Croc, because while he was brand new to League Zero, he had experience managing top OD teams in the Australian Overwatch scene. No one was sure how we'd manage the time difference with his players, or how the path to pro skills would translate to a community like ours, but everyone was eager to find out. Come draft time, and unsurprisingly, we saw a wide variety of tactics for who was picked up and what internal structures teams are going for. The one thing that remained consistent is that Inter B levied a lot of criticisms against Inter A's draft. Very few of the Inter A teams beside Papega were taken seriously, and it was assumed that they would be the easier of the two subdivisions. Of course, there was almost no way to find out, as they wouldn't play each other until playoffs, but there wasn't much Inter A could say to defend themselves for the time being. The majority just seemed to brush off the banter and focus on their goals instead. Dunning-Kruger effect was probably the most widely criticized teams coming out of the draft, as they picked up a good majority of the players who competed together in a Snowball Cup team known as the Quiet E-Girls. Unfortunately, that team didn't perform very well, and it didn't look like DKE managed to get the stronger aspects of the former group in their draft. They were almost unanimously considered to be a bottom-place team in the preseason power rankings, and the appearance of their manager being inactive didn't help much either. Bob Burgers had a lot to live up to coming out of Season 1, as they were that season's redemption story, going from the bottom of the barrel to a championship caliber team that fell short at the last minute. Nevertheless, a few of the old guard would be sticking around to compete under the same banner, with Sloth being the only one to return as a player. Aside from a few of the lesser known names for Season 1 Novice, most of Bot's pickups weren't very popular free agents heading into the draft. This had a lot of the community confused about whether or not they didn't do enough scouting, or they did more than expected to pick up dimes in the rough. The lowest average SR of the team compared to the rest of the intermediate had some worried, but for the most part, the consensus was that Bot Burgers would be placed in the middle to lower end of the power rankings. CDC Esports went for the more predictable strategy of picking up mostly their friend group, with standout names including their management, Sirmi Advantage, as well as Season 1 champion Jeff. It was widely known that these players were prone to tilting, so most analysts placed them in the middle upper end of the bracket because as long as they could keep winning games, they'd probably be okay in terms of mentality. If they started to lose, however, everyone predicted that they'd start to crumble apart.
One circumstance that immediately threw up a few red flags for CDC was the fact that Jeff didn't seem happy at all that he didn't get on a team with his friends on Papega Parrots. He made it very clear that he intended to play with them no matter the cost. This meant that for a while, CDC would have a disgustingly stacked roster for the first 3 games. They need to have a backup main tank ready to go by the time the trading window opened, or else. Vitalize had probably one of the most confusing drafts out of all the intermediate teams, as he had picked up Grape extremely early in the drafting process. Most of the community didn't take Grape very seriously, despite him performing well in Season 1 whenever he got the chance to. When asked why the contentious pickup, Croc said that they intended to build a team around Grape's aggressiveness and go from there. Because of such an out-of-the-ordinary plan, analysts weren't very sure about where to place Vitalize. They were placed all over the spectrum, some power rankings having them near the top, while others had them near at the bottom. The one thing that was for certain was that the team itself weren't rearing to prove themselves as a law, more than just memes. The revival of Double Cap was an interesting ordeal to say the least. Coming off of Season 1, where the original version of the brand, some of the best scouting the community has ever seen, Platinum Bowl's version in Season 2 went for much safer and arguably more stable picks during the draft. Players like Orange Juice, T-Sen, and even former Leaf Stack Pain were reasonably good players, though the team seemed to be lacking in star potential they need to claim the top few spots in most people's power rankings. Papega Parrots arguably came out with the biggest initial surprise of the intermediate draft. though looking back it probably shouldn't have been. Unfortunately for Shash, most of his Season 1 championship roster had gone on to manage teams of their own, leaving him with few options for people he already knew that were up to their caliber. Instead, he turned to the rivals turned friends in Season 1 Plat Chat roster that defeated him in the grand finals. Aside from Jeff being sniped by CDC, Madam going on to be a captain of Shanghai, PP was picked up by PH, and Ois was forced into advance, they did claim the majority of their friend group, and with Viper, Sherlock, Chicken, and Kizgo to fill in the gaps, Pega Parrots were immediately considered not only a top team in Inter-A, but also all of Intermediate as well.
With the few weeks between the draft itself and the first weekend of games, most of the teams use this time to get used to their lineups and experiment around with strategies. Of course, the meta shifted drastically from Double Shield to May McCree Brawl a week prior to the first games, though none of the teams in Inter-A reported having too much trouble, nor too many complaints about this change. In fact, the only one to complain openly while gathering information for this video was TanicB. The kid hates playing May. A lot. Sure enough, the first round of matches came by and early statements were made about who would dominate the early parts of the season. CDC had an explosive start, managing to sweep DC despite the latter not looking terrible all things considered. Pega managed to take down Vitalize in a rather close 3-1 series, and Botburgers cemented themselves as not the worst team at the moment by sweeping DKE. The cracks did start to show here and there as the weeks went by, and teams' weaknesses became even more obvious as the community got to see more of their play. Pega looked very dependent on their mental stability going into a game. Vitalize struggled to close out matches despite having some incredibly close losses. DC seemed to have trouble with management not knowing what roster moves were best at any point in time. Botburgers looked more comfortable on non-meta heroes despite usually playing the meta. DKA lacked any form of focus, and CDC didn't have any apparent weaknesses. Yet. As previously stated, Vitalize would consistently put up great performances, and constantly look like a dark horse that could burn their way through the standings if they cleaned up their play ever so slightly. Unfortunately, they always seemed to play to the level of their opponents rather than to their own potential for the first couple of weeks. They claimed some crucial wins over teams like DC and CDC, but then also lost to Pega and even let Botburgers tape them to a map 5. Their play was impressive, but sloppy for the first half. Botburgers looked like they were just a few steps away from being considered the league's version of the Chengdu Hunters by pulling out off-meta strategies and making them work, but they always fell short at that last step. They would always try to force meta, which they looked less clean on, and then swap over to comfort picks to stall, and then proceed to roll. Unfortunately, they couldn't run purely comfort picks 24/7 as teams would start to expect and counter that, but most analysts were calling for them to implement smaller hero swaps in for just a few positions for slightly off-meta strategies while allowing them to reap the benefits of playing most of the meta. Really, they just needed to come up with a plan and stick to it. DKE was much less enjoyable to watch. At least Botburgers took a few maps here and there. Over the course of the entire first half of the season, DKE managed to win only 3 maps and no games. They had some incredible performances at times, but only briefly, portions of maps really. Wiz in particular was looking to be an early MVP candidate with his insane performances on Hitscan, but one man alone can't carry a team. They seemed to lack any focus at all in-game, part of which was supposedly caused by contention between the Captain Null and the rest of the roster. While it is impossible to know the full story of what went on inside the team at the time, many analysts agreed that it appeared as though their captain was taking more of a "I'll do it myself" mentality while leading the team. Regardless of the real problems that happened back then, the results were the same, going 0-5 to start off the season. According to the management of Double Cap themselves, they were going through a lot of serious issues of not knowing exactly what choices to make to lead the team in the right direction, which caused a lot of confusion and smaller bouts of drama from within. Though from the outside looking in, it was much harder to figure this out, as DC was still performing rather well as a mid-table team, all things considered. Despite their moderate success, however, Ranter would leave his assistant manager position for CDC, which would temporarily take away a lot of leadership from the team. Zen would later step up and take a more active role in managing. Despite a tough loss to CDC in Week 2, the Pega Parrots were performing rather well. They were still considered highly dependent on their mentality leading up to matches, but otherwise they were definitely a force to be reckoned with. That is, until the Chicken incident. The short of it is that Chicken had an unfortunate accident, I guess we can call it, where he typed in obscenity in match chat, which got him suspended halfway through the game and for the following 2 matches. This utterly destroyed the team's morale, having to find multiple subs to fill the hit scan role for the following weeks. They did manage to win one of their games without Chicken, but a tough loss to DC in Week 4 meant that they were definitely questioning how good their record could have been at the half had the whole situation not happened. CDC by this point were sitting pretty at the top of the overall standings for Intermediate, however there was a storm slowly brewing from underneath the surface. Despite their immaculate record and incredible performances, they still had to deal with Jeff not wanting to be on the team for the entire season, and nothing they could do was convincing him to stay. Eventually, Sermi accepted the fact that Jeff was going to leave, which he immediately did after Week 3 when the signing window opened. The one solace the team could take was that Jeff was too impatient to wait for a trade opportunity and forced himself into a 2-week period of ineligibility. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, CDC would never fully recover from the issues plaguing their main tank spot, and would have to suffer inactivity from their stand-ins for a good majority of the rest of the season. At the halfway mark in the regular season, Inter-A consisted of CDC practically dominating everyone with their 4-1 record, Vitalize sharing their match record but sitting a little bit behind in map differential, Papega and DC riding just underneath with more middling scorelines, and then Botburgers and DKE bringing up the rear. The season was far from over, and there was still plenty of time to turn it all around for everyone at this point, but of course that also meant there was plenty of room for more insanity to ensue. Along with the new map pool and plenty of rematches, the second half of the regular season brought with it hero pools that promised to shake up the meta on a weekly basis. This meant that teams who were absolutely crushing the competition previously would also have to be able to adapt in order to stay on top. While there wasn't any guarantee that those already struggling to find their groove could suddenly gain momentum, at the very least everyone was experiencing the chaos together. Sure enough, it didn't take very long for the first upset to happen, as DKE had slowly been gathering new pieces for their roster, including players like Haishan and their manager Kit. They didn't look incredible quite yet, but at the very least everyone was starting to take notice that you couldn't just roll over the scrappy underdogs without trying anymore. They still had trouble closing out series when it really mattered, but most analysts assumed that their rematch with Botburgers would be DKE's best shot at avoiding a winless season. The series was long and painful for just about everyone involved, but after a grueling 6 maps, Dunning-Kruger Effect came out on top with their first win of all season. A lot more can be said about Botburgers and what led to this unfortunate loss, however, as they had plenty of troubles of their own. Octo stepped down as manager in order to just coach for a brief period before leaving entirely for CDC, leaving Aunt Jemima to step into the void left behind. Jemima was self-admittedly unsure of what to do, and this self-doubt would continue on for much of the season. Despite their absolutely dominant first half of the season, the cracks started to show for CDC. Losing Jeff was expected, but definitely not intended. Not only did they lose an extremely sought-after main tank, but Sermi was completely lost about who could fill those shoes. Various replacements were made to the role over the course of the season, though none of them would stay for very long, and ultimately it would be simultaneously the most and least consequential role for CDC. The lack of an anchor for the team eventually took its toll, allowing others like Papega, Vitalize, and DC to catch up. They started to lose games, and one by one CDC began losing players as tensions rose. Sermi himself considered abandoning the team and leaving for Papega at one point, though he did decide to rough it out till the end. Unfortunately, not all would make the same choice, as many of their star players such as Vantage would leave for greener pastures. Vitalize managed to surprise a lot of the community by coming off such a hot streak from the first half of the season. However, by the second half, drama started to bubble to the surface. Copydog and Great Cub began to take a more active role in making decisions for who would play and who was picked up, leading to disputes among the players. Most notably, Grape and Akimbo eventually left for Powerhouse and Overcharge respectively. For a time they looked stable, though they would have some incredibly close matches at the hands of Botburgers and the then struggling CDC. From the outside looking in, the future was very uncertain for the supposed dark horse of Intermediate. Double Cap had a rough first half of the season, with consistently shifting management in terms of who is stepping up to make the big decisions. However, the second half is where Plapo really started to step up and take the leadership position as he was expected to have as manager. They made multiple pickups over a short period of time, such as Aqua, Sev Dunham, and Don Bongo. That last player in particular proved to be incredibly vital to DC's success for the remainder of the season, as he provided a bombastically successful main tank for the rest of the team to rally around. DC went on to be undefeated for the entire second half of the season, and they were only second to Papega due to map differential. While CDC was reeling after the loss of their main tank, Jeff served his period of ineligibility and reunited with his friend group on Papega. Their intended lineup from the draft was now as completed as it was going to get. The team mostly played off the synergy they had by that point, and while some games were much closer than they would have liked, most of Intermediate A still fell before them. Toward the end of the regular season, with just a few games remaining, tensions between the players and management of Vitalize had grown enough for a motion to be made to remove Croc from his position as manager and place Copydog in his place. The vote passed unanimously among the players, and Croc was replaced, much to the dismay of many former Vitalize players. Akimbo in particular was heavily critical of the new management, and blamed them for the troubles the team had earlier on in the season. Around this time, most of the teams the Vitalize alumni were on were successful, while Vitalize themselves were struggling, leading to a certain amount of vindication. A good majority of the intermediate community piled onto the bandwagon, and thus the All My Homies Hate Vitalize meme was born. The end of the regular season went off with more of a whimper than a bang, as DC finished out the perfect 5-0 half season. Botburgers just kinda gave up against Papega, and CDC refused to even show up to their game against the more promising roster of DKE. Vitalize put up a good fight, and took DC to a map 6 before eventually falling. Botburgers looked to be resigned to the fact that they couldn't even qualify for playoffs anymore, and most analysts were expecting DKE to win with their newer roster, even if CDC showed up. Though, to be honest, it is unfortunate that they were too cowardly to even give DKE a fair shot to prove themselves one last time.
To no one's surprise, the 4 teams to qualify for playoffs for Intermediate A were Papega Parrots, Double Cap, CDC Esports, and Vitalize. Botburgers and DKE just couldn't pull it together in time, though most suspected that DKE could have stolen CDC's spot if they had formed their final roster much sooner in the regular season. But we'll never really know what would have happened, so there's not much point in speculation here. With about 1 week to go before the quarterfinals hit, the absolute worst thing that could happen to a team came about. With that being Dom Bongo of DC being discovered as a smurf of Slam Jam Jamal. Jamal was just barely considered advanced at the time for signups at the beginning of the regular season. So he decided to sign up on an alternate account that placed just a little lower than his main, which was enough to qualify for the upper edge of Intermediate. Obviously, he was found out and promptly banned with only a week before playoffs started, utterly robbing DC of their MVP caliber main tank. The truly tragic part is that Jamal had placed much lower on his main account during the regular season than he had at the time of signups months prior, meaning that he may have had a chance to appeal and be moved down to Intermediate legitimately, but instead he tried to deceive the entire community, which resulted in his ban. In their quarterfinals match against Powerhouse, DC struggled to find their footing. They had some absolutely spectacular moments from players like Scrollpan, but in the end it wasn't enough, and they would end up losing the series in the map 5. Nini and Master Dempsey performed valiantly while filling in on main tank leading up to the game, but it was unfortunately too terrible a situation for the team to recover in such a short time. While DC may have bowed out in the quarterfinals, they earned a lot of respect from the entire community for taking as far as they did. Powerhouse in particular has gone on record to say it was one of their hardest and most intense series of the entire season. The rest of Intermediate A wasn't faring much better in their matches either. In fact, the time DC made it the furthest against Powerhouse, CDC only managed to take a map off Shanghai, and Papega Parrots didn't even take any maps against Yoink. CDC had more or less given up by that point in the season. While they wanted to give it one last go in the postseason, it didn't really pan out the way they wanted. Papega, on the other hand, suffered a terrible week of scrims and some internet issues, meaning that they couldn't practice with their main roster enough to feel comfortable. Sure enough, the least mentally stable team in the entire league boomed themselves before they even got a chance to get into the lobby for playoffs.
Vitalize was the last man standing, and things weren't looking good. They were already down 2-0 against White, and they weren't particularly close losses either. Jolt looked incredible as an individual on the Genji and Pharah, but otherwise the rest of the team felt out of sync. And if they didn't do anything soon, Vitalize would follow the quarterfinals just like everyone predicted, and Intermediate B would go on to utterly dominate the entire semifinals bracket. And just like that, as if by magic, something clicked with Vitalize during the third map. When their backs were against the wall and they couldn't lose a single map anymore, they started playing like the dark horses everyone thought they were months prior. They just barely managed to hold on to the third map, putting their name on the board and delaying what felt like their inevitable defeat for just a little longer. As the series progressed, Wait What looked less sure of themselves, and Vitalize started ramping up to a level no one thought was possible. They kept the fourth map relatively close, but Vitalize had a massive time advantage that led them to yet another win, tying up the series and sending them to Nepal for the tiebreaker. Once they set foot in the final control round, it was as if they had never lost any maps to begin with. Vitalize utterly decimated Wait What and completed the reverse sweep. They did what no one expected it and only 9% of analysts thought was possible. They brought Intermediate A past the quarterfinals. The semifinals were much less eventful from Inter A's perspective. Vitalize were carried by their momentum from the previous week and stomped Yoink pretty handily. Most were expecting Yoink to put up some level of contention considering their late season revival, but it just wasn't meant to be. Vitalize closed out the series 3-1, with a particularly brutal first point hold on the final map of Dorado to add that extra salt to the wound. And just like that, the grand finals were set to take place. Vitalize versus Shanghai Sellouts, Intermediate A versus Intermediate B. The underdogs no one believed could make it this far, versus the chosen ones who could all but taste their inevitable victory. Vitalize weren't entirely sure how far they'd make it through the postseason, so as you can imagine they were pretty amped to be one game away from taking home the champion role. Of course, it wouldn't be easy, as Shanghai had been utterly dominant and even managed to defeat Powerhouse for the first time to make it to the finals. It didn't help that their starting main take Nemo had been away for almost the entire week leading up to the finals match, meaning that they didn't have as much time to practice with them as they would have liked. But while they weren't certain what the outcome would be, they were determined to make Shanghai Sellouts work for it. We all know how the series ended, with Shanghai taking the win 4-1. But the scoreline alone doesn't exactly entail how much Vitalize made them work for it. Just about every single map, maybe besides the last one, was extremely close. And with just a few different plays made, this series very easily could have gone a much further distance. Unfortunately, those plays weren't made, and Vitalize were forced to bow out of Season 2 Intermediate with the runner-up title.
Personally, I'm still shocked at just how much trash talk Inter A had to sit through. Coming out of the draft, sure, there was a lot of question marks with teams like DKE or Botburgers, but the majority of the division definitely had a lot more potential than anyone in Inter B was apparently willing to admit. What shocked me even more is that a lot of the teams in Inter A actually believed the trash talk coming from Inter B. They didn't even try to banter back, they just accepted the "we suck" mentality. The only teams that didn't were the few that were considered successful by the end of the season. Vitalize, Double Cap, and arguably to a lesser extent late season DKE are the epitome of ignoring whatever criticism is coming your way and just focusing on doing your best in spite of it. They were the ones who were willing to take that uphill battle against the naysayers and do the very thing everyone was saying they couldn't and prove approximately 92% of the community wrong all at once. Like it or not, Inter A scaled that mountainside, and while they may not have been the ones to stand at the very peak, they were the only ones able to just be a few paces behind, holding their flag higher than almost anyone else.